Hi, welcome to this video about Mars Curiosity, a REST library for Embarcadero Delphi. This video is about authentication and authorization in your Mars Curiosity application servers. My name is Andrea Magni, I'm a computer engineer and I live in Italy. I'm a long-time Delphi developer and an Embarcadero MVP. You can find more information about me at my personal website. Authentication is the process of actually confirming an identity. Usually, you have a user with some credentials and let your system recognize him to gain him some privilege or not, or gain access to some resources or not. So we have a user and a server system. The server system has some information to validate users, active users, and their credentials. And so we have that the user presents himself to the server system with his credentials, saying, okay, I'm Andrea, my password is 12345. The server system can check if a user named Andrea actually exists and it is active, and if the credential matches. Not a good idea to store password, but it's just an example. And what happens then is that usually in a classic approach, you have session data that it has been created on the server side once the user has been recognized as valid. So what happens is that the server side, the server can construct some data about the user with some additional information like the nationality or the gender, the age, and so on. And this data is stored on the server side and marked with an identifier, that is the session ID. The session ID is then given to the client that will use it, endorsing each request with this session ID. Sometimes you will find this implemented with some cookie-based approach and similar approaches. So the client and the server shares the session ID, but the session data lives on the server side of the system. A new scenario is taking a very huge popularity these days, is the token-based scenario, and it has some similarities, of course, because we have a user and a server system that obviously has to be able to validate the user credential. And once the user presents himself with credentials as he did in the previous example, the server can recognize him as a valid user, and now the server will build a token that is a piece of information stored and encoded in a certain way, and this token is given to the user without having to store a copy of the token on the server side and so on, and can contain the additional data we have seen in the previous example. So the token will be now endorsed on each request the client will perform to the server, and the server has no server-side data to handle or to manage. So as we are moving session data from the server side to the client side. And the main benefit we can get is scalability, because if all we need to produce the result, the response of this request, comes within the request, it means that there's no clue in which instance of your application server will handle the request. So you can have multiple instances of your application server, and the system will scale very well this way. Also, not having server-side data means that if the server-side software has to be restarted or become unavailable for a while, it is no longer a problem. as long as the token data is stored and managed by the client. I don't want to delve too much into this technology because a lot of information is available on the web. I just leave you these two links to a very useful websites that can help you better understand how tokens works. And in particular, I'm using JWT, that is JSON Web Token, a technology that has become very popular these days. Let's get started with Mars Curiosity and JWT. I will use the Mars Authorization demo, and this demo has free resources exposed through the REST interface, and I will concentrate on the token resource. This resource represents what the client can do to manipulate the token, and there's an example into the library on how to implement this resource. You can use it or just have a look to implement your own strategy. This resource will respond to the get, post, and delete verbs. And if you perform a post on this resource passing two parameters that are username and password, if authentication succeeds, a token will be built by the server using a secret parameter that you can customize. We will talk about that in another video. And a JSON representation of the token is sent back to the client. So performing a post on this resource is the way a client can send his credentials and get back the token he will use for further requests to this server. So let's try. We can run the server. I will use Postman as client, and I know that my server responds to HTTP localhost REST default application, and there's a token resource. I want to perform a post request. I will set a username that is Andrea and a password that is the current hour of the day, that means 17 right now. If I send my request, what I get is a JSON object where I can easily identify the JWT token, that is this part of the text, and I can copy this token and, for example, have a look at the JWT.io website, where there's a parser of the token. We can have a look at what this token actually contains. So there's the debugger, so we can simply pass here our token, and we can see information here decoded. So we can see that the issuer is Mars Curiosity. There's a timestamp on the issue.time and an expiration. There's my username, a custom claim that is just an example on how to add custom claims in Mars Curiosity. And there's another claim that lists roles that are associated to this user. It tells me invalid signature because here you will have to write the secret that I'm using. That is a piece of information that has to be secret, of course, that is used to verify if the token has been tampered or anything else. So that's it, and let's have a look on how we can use now this token to perform some request to the server. I told you that there are roles tied to this username. So we will now step back a bit to the slides and cover authorization in Mass Curiosity. Authorization is a way to define access policies to something. In a REST server application, we are defining access policies to resources or sub-resources. So, for example, we can state that everybody can access a resource listing some items, but only power user can modify items, and only admin users can add or modify or delete items from the list. So what we are facing here is a role-based authorization mechanism, because it has been implemented this way into Mass Curiosity, and each user has a set of roles, and resources, sub-resources can be decorated with some attributes that states if the user needs to have a specific role to gain access to this resource or sub-resource, or if everyone is allowed to perform a get or a post on this resource, or if a resource has to be inaccessible. So it is a quite simple mechanism, and once you have defined that the user has provided valid credentials, you usually are able also to assign a set of roles to this user. And so once the user has got a token from the server side, he will use this token to perform some other request. This request will match some resources, and given the resources are decorated with some attributes you can see on the slide, like permit all or roles allowed, you will have a way to check if this request is legal or not. Mass Curiosity will enforce this policy for you, and you don't have to code anything about that. You simply have to decorate your resources and sub-resources. So let's have a look at the Mass Authorization demo. Once we have got our token, if we get back to the resources we have in this server, we will notice that the first resource has a get method that will provide us some public informations that has to be freely available, and so has been decorated with the permit all attributes. So what I think is that if I ask my Postman client to perform a get request on the default application on the first resource, what I get is public information here. That means this resource has no constraints about getting access to the execution of this first resource. But what if I ask also for details? That is a sub-resource of my resource, and what I get is an error telling me that access is forbidden. This is due to the way the detailed sub-resource has been decorated, because we need to have the admin role to access these informations. What I can do is to get back to the default token resource and perform another post using an admin user. My password is still 17. Now I have authentication has succeeded and I have my token. I simply have to get back to my get on the first details sub-resource, but I have to specify my authorization header with a value that is bearer and my token. So this is a standard described in the links I have left you in the slides. And what I get if I send this request is OK, and I will get access to this admin level access information. So it's the same request on the same URL, but the authorization header will send to the server the token that contains the description of the roles my user has been allowed to have. The authorization attributes are also cascading from resources to sub-resources. So the second resource will prove you that you can decorate the resource, and you will find that each method and each sub-resource will inherit the same constraint. Consider also that the deny all attribute will prevent any request. So if you want to check, you will have to remove the attribute. So let's see what happens if I ask for a get on the second resource. It will fail. It will tell me it is forbidden, and this is due to the presence of the deny all attribute. If I remove the attribute and I recompile my application, I can send again the request with the same token. Please note I have restarted my server, and what I get is the value of my method, that is the default string in this case, but I have actually succeeded in performing the request. So that's all, and this is the very basics of JWT authentication and authorization in Mars Curiosity applications. Thanks for watching, and I want to remember you some useful links if you want to get some extra information about Mars Curiosity. Also, feel free to contact me if you have any questions or follow the Google Plus community. Thanks. Bye bye.